Welcome to True Echo, where silence speaks louder than words, and justice doesn't always need a courtroom. Today's story is not just about a school, a bully, or a fight. It's about a storm that waited in silence, until one boy crossed a line he could never uncross. This is the true power of restraint, until that restraint runs out. Ridgeway High looked like it had been pulled out of a movie set. Red brick buildings, freshly mowed lawns, wide glass windows with polished silver frames that shimmered under the Virginia sun. The fall leaves painted the whole school in strokes of gold and crimson. To an outsider, it was perfect. A model of suburban excellence where students walked with confidence, wore $1,000 sneakers, and laughed like nothing in the world could touch them. But under the surface, Ridgeway wasn't about education. It was about hierarchy. And no one embodied that hierarchy more than Blake Radcliffe. He wasn't just the captain of the football team. He was the son of Principal Thomas Radcliffe, a man who was once a conservative icon in the local school board, a former football hero turned disciplinarian with a smile that never reached his eyes. Blake had inherited not only his father's broad frame and pale blue eyes, but the entire weight of the Radcliffe legacy. And he wore it like a crown. Blake didn't need to punch people in the face. He didn't need to shout. He destroyed people with whispers, well-timed smirks, and strategic humiliation. Students knew better than to cross him. He owned the hallways like a king owns a court, and everyone who walked it knew their rank. Until Madison Carter arrived. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic. In fact, she barely spoke at all. 16 years old, slim frame, always in a faded gray hoodie and old jeans. She didn't carry a designer bag. She didn't post selfies. She didn't laugh at the jokes Blake made in class. She didn't laugh at all. On her first day, she sat alone at the back of homeroom, unbothered by the stares and the whispers. Nobody said hello. Nobody invited her to sit with them at lunch. She didn't seem to mind. Her desk was always by the window. Her notebook always opened before class started. Her presence didn't fit the Ridgeway mold, and that's why it unnerved them. She didn't react. Not when students made snide remarks about diversity quotas. Not when someone accidentally spilled soda on her sketchbook. Not when her locker was filled with crumpled papers and chewed gum. She didn't flinch. She didn't retaliate. She just watched. Blake didn't like that. Because his power, relied on fear. And fear relied on reaction. But Madison didn't give him one. She didn't give anyone one. And that's when Blake decided she needed to be taught a lesson. It started small. The kinds of things that wouldn't get him in trouble but that everyone would notice. A casual bump in the hallway. Standing in front of her locker just long enough to make her wait. Dropping comments like, "Didn't know we were admitting students from the South Side now." She never bit back. She never even changed her pace. If anything, she looked amused, but not in a smug way. It was like she was watching a movie she'd already seen, and she knew exactly how it ended. That only made it worse. Blake's friends noticed too. Tyler, Sean, Marcus. They joined in, half because they thought it was funny, half because no one wanted to be the one Blake turned on next. Then came the day of the drawing. Madison had left her sketchbook on her desk during gym class. Blake flipped through it when no one was watching. Page after page of detailed portraits, mostly black women, some old, some young. Some wore braided crowns. Some stared directly at the viewer with bold, unflinching eyes. It was powerful, honest work. Blake didn't see art. He saw an opportunity. He tore out a page with a sketch that looked like Madison and stuck it on the whiteboard before class. He wrote underneath it in thick, red marker, "Wakanda forever. Princess goes to class." The laughter was scattered. Some students stayed quiet. Others snickered behind their hands. Madison entered the room, saw the drawing, walked up to it, removed the page, folded it slowly, and put it into her hoodie pocket. Then she sat down like nothing had happened. No tears. No outburst. No retaliation. Blake couldn't understand it. That kind of restraint? It didn't fit his logic. And in the twisted landscape of Ridgeway High, logic belonged to those in power. But Madison wasn't playing his game. She was waiting for him to cross the line. And he would. Because power like his always made the same mistake. Blake Radcliffe had never met someone like Madison Carter. And that terrified him, though he'd never admit it. His dominance at Ridgeway thrived on predictable patterns. You poke, they flinch. You mock, they retreat. You push, they break. It was like physics. He was the gravity and everyone else eventually hit the floor. But Madison? She defied gravity. And the more she did, the more obsessed he became. By the third week of school, she was no longer just a quiet new girl in the eyes of Ridgeway. She was that girl. The girl who wouldn't smile, wouldn't cry, wouldn't beg. Rumors swirled. Some said she was a genius, others said she was on the spectrum. A few whispered she might be dangerous. But no one really knew because Madison didn't talk. She watched. And when Madison watched, she remembered. She remembered the jocks with their fake bravado. The girls who wore cruelty like lipstick. The teachers who ignored snide remarks because the boys who made them had fathers on the school board. She remembered it all with the clarity of someone who had grown up in a different world. A world where silence wasn't weakness but survival. Her father, Jerome Carter, taught her that. He had seen war zones, trained in deserts, and returned with scars both seen and unseen. But he had never taught Madison to fight out of anger. He taught her to fight with precision, discipline, control. You don't strike unless you have to, he told her. But when you do, make sure they never forget. Blake was getting close to giving her a reason. It wasn't just the sketch. The next week he began following her. At first, from a distance, down the hallway outside the art room across the courtyard. Always just far enough that no teacher would question it. But Madison noticed. Of course she noticed. Blake wasn't as clever as he thought he was. He left trails, the silence behind her growing louder, the group of boys snickering just before she entered a room, the way he would linger just a second too long near her locker. One morning he waited by the bike rack. It was early. Mist still clung to the grass. Madison arrived alone as usual, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. As she unlocked her bike, Blake stepped out from behind a tree. You know, he said casually, most people here don't like you. Madison didn't look up. Not that you care, he added with a grin. I mean, it's kind of impressive how you walk around like nobody matters. Like you're above it all. She adjusted her helmet. Is that how it works where you're from? Just act like a ghost until someone notices you? Still no reaction. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Or maybe someone taught you to stay silent around people like me. That made her pause. Her fingers stopped adjusting the strap. She turned her head, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet his eyes for a single second. Try crossing the line, she said softly. It was the first time Blake had ever heard her speak. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. And for the first time he felt something stir deep inside, a flash of hesitation. But pride is a stubborn thing, especially in boys raised to believe they're untouchable. Blake smirked, brushing it off. He'd break her eventually. That same afternoon he found her in the west hallway, the quiet wing of the building most students avoided. It was where the old lockers were, the ones with broken hinges and faint rust near the bottom. Madison liked that hallway. No noise. No eyes. But today Blake was waiting. He leaned against the lockers, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with intent. Not going to say hello? He called as she approached. She said nothing. Just walked to her locker and twisted the combination. Blake stepped closer. Nice jewelry, he said, reaching for the silver chain that always hung around her neck. Let me hold on to it for a few days. He didn't wait for an answer. The chain snapped in his hand. The pendant, a small worn silver charm shaped like a flower, landed in his palm with a soft, metallic click. Blake grinned. An antique? Or a relic from slave ancestors? He didn't expect what came next. He didn't expect Madison to turn slowly, eyes locking onto his with a gaze so cold, so surgical, it made his smirk falter. Give it back, she said. Blake laughed. Say please, and I'll consider it. Her feet shifted. Her shoulders squared. She wasn't the quiet girl anymore. The shift was so subtle, so fluid, that Blake didn't register what was happening until it was too late. In a flash, her hand clamped down on his wrist, twisting it with mechanical precision. His mouth opened in shock, but before he could shout, her knee drove into the side of his leg, knocking him off balance. In the same motion, she grabbed his collar and, with a practiced turn of her hips, slammed him onto the tile floor. Art. The hallway echoed. Blake's breath escaped in a grunt. Pain shot through his back. He blinked rapidly, disoriented. She knelt beside him, her knee pressing into his arm, pinning him effortlessly. This is the last time you touch anything that belongs to me, she said, voice steady. You're not a child, Radcliffe. You're the problem. She pried his fingers open, took the pendant, and stood up. Blake remained on the floor, shaking, humiliated. Not because of the pain, but because she had let him go. She could have done more. He felt it. He saw it in her eyes. But she didn't. She had chosen not to destroy him. And that, for the first time in his life, made Blake Radcliffe feel powerless. News at Ridgeway spread faster than facts could catch up. Rumors mutated mid-sentence, bloated with exaggeration, twisted with envy or awe. But this time it didn't need embellishment. By the end of the day, half the school had heard that Blake Radcliffe had been taken down in the west hallway. Not shoved. Not yelled at. Taken down. And not by a senior linebacker. Not by another jock. By Madison Carter. The quiet black girl with the sketchbook. At first, students didn't believe it. It wasn't possible. Blake had been untouchable since freshman year. He once made a junior cry during an assembly with a single whispered comment. He made teachers flinch just by walking into the room. But now people were saying he got thrown onto the floor like a sack of laundry, didn't even fight back, and had to say, "Please." The disbelief shattered once the video surfaced. Someone, no one knew who, had been around the corner with their phone, recording the last few seconds. It was shaky, blurry, but unmistakable. Blake on the floor. Madison above him. Her hand gripping his wrist. His voice broken, soft. "Please." The school wasn't the same after that. Madison didn't speak about it. Not during classes. Not during lunch. She didn't change her walk. She didn't start wearing makeup or sitting in the popular section of the cafeteria. She still ate alone, still carried her sketchbook, still wore that same gray hoodie. But people looked at her differently now. Not with disgust. With caution. Some with respect. Some with curiosity. Some with fear. And Blake, he vanished. Not physically but in presence. The loud walk was gone. The smirks, the comments, the hands casually shoved into people's personal space. All of it disappeared. When he passed by, students didn't part like they used to. Some didn't even look up. Others glanced away as if unsure if they were supposed to still fear him. In the locker room, Blake said nothing. Tyler cracked a joke about the video. Sean said it was probably staged. Blake didn't respond. He stared at his phone screen where messages kept piling up. Snaps. Memes. Someone had made a GIF loop of the moment he hit the ground. Someone else had edited it with cartoon sound effects. Every time he turned on his phone, it was there, his own face twisted in surprise, then defeat. That moment frozen. Immortal. It wasn't just the physical act. It was the implications. She had power. Real power. And she'd chosen not to break him. Which meant she could have. That terrified Blake more than the moment itself. For someone raised on dominance, who had learned from birth that status was something you took by force, it was incomprehensible. Power was supposed to be loud. Angry. Boastful. It came with fists, fame, and fear. Madison's didn't. It came in silence. It came with control. And it came at exactly the moment it was needed, and not a second before. Blake started to spiral. He avoided the hall where it happened. Stopped making eye contact in class. He walked slower, like every step weighed more than the last. Even his posture changed. Shoulders hunched instead of wide, arms crossed over his chest instead of swinging with ease. The worst part? Madison didn't acknowledge him. Not once. Not even a glance. And that, somehow, burned more than any insult ever could. Because she wasn't playing his game anymore. She had ended it. One afternoon, Blake sat outside the counselor's office, pretending to wait for someone. In truth, he was watching her again, from afar. Madison sat under the maple tree by the art wing, sketchbook on her knees, pencil moving in quick, confident strokes. She looked peaceful. Not victorious. Not smug. Just calm. And that's when it hit him. She hadn't done it to win. She hadn't needed to win. She just needed to end it. And he had given her the reason. Later that evening, as the autumn sun dipped behind the school's tall brick buildings, Blake lingered in the empty football field. He stood on the 40-yard line, helmet in hand, trying to steady his thoughts. He wasn't used to silence. He missed the noise, the control, the power. But he knew, deep in his chest, in the ache of his pride, that none of that belonged to him anymore. And it wouldn't return. Not unless she gave it back. And she wouldn't. She didn't need to. Madison Carter had done what no teacher, no coach, no parent had ever managed to do. She humbled him. Not by force, but by showing restraint. And in a world built on domination, that kind of control was terrifying. Madison Carter didn't wake up the next day expecting to be a name on every student's lips. She had seen it all before, the shift in whispers, the sudden hush when she passed by, the widening eyes in the hallway. It was the same rhythm as back in South Chicago after the first time she defended her brother, when the silence that followed was heavier than any shout. But Ridgeway was different. Here, silence wasn't just silence. It was attention. It was observation. It was discomfort wearing a mask. By the time second period rolled around, Madison already knew a video had surfaced. She didn't need to see it. She didn't need to know who recorded it. It didn't matter. The damage had been done, not to her but to Blake Radcliffe's illusion. And illusions, once broken, don't come back together. Not cleanly. She took her seat in English class near the window as usual. Outside, the wind rustled the maple leaves, scattering a few onto the stone path below. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The teacher, Miss Ferris, cleared her throat as she pulled up the attendance on the board. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone to treat each other with respect. Our words and actions, they echo whether we see it or not. The class was still. Some students nodded. Some stared blankly. Others shifted awkwardly, clearly pretending not to know exactly what Miss Ferris was referring to. Blake sat 3 rows ahead, slouched low in his chair, his once polished posture now caved in. He didn't look back. He hadn't since the incident. Madison pulled out her notebook and began sketching. Not to escape. To ground herself. The movements of her pencil had always helped her think clearly, lines turning into faces, curves becoming motion, emotion captured in graphite. Her hand moved steadily, almost with purpose, even as the classroom around her buzzed with the tension of unspoken questions. Who was she really? Where did she learn to fight like that? Why had she never said anything before? No one dared to ask out loud, of course. But the curiosity was everywhere, in darting glances, in the sudden quiet when she walked into a room, in the newfound space that parted in front of her in the hallway without anyone needing to be told. She didn't walk differently. But everyone moved around her differently now. Later that day, as Madison sat quietly at her usual lunch table, a shadow crossed over her tray. It wasn't Blake. It was Malik Johnson, a junior from the wrestling team. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that rarely rose above a casual mutter, Malik wasn't known for getting involved in drama. But he didn't hesitate as he sat down across from her. "You train jiu-jitsu?" he asked, not as a challenge but as someone genuinely curious. Madison looked up, studying his face for a moment, then nodded once. Malik gave a short, low whistle. "I've seen that throw before. It's not something you learn in school." Still no reaction. Then he added, "I saw the video. Everyone has. But I recognized you from something else." She paused. "I was at the Illinois State meet last year," he said. "You weren't just competing. You won. You choked out a coach. Big guy. 200 pounds at least. That was you, right?" Madison didn't nod this time. She didn't deny it either. Malik leaned back. "Why'd you hide that?" A beat of silence passed before she finally spoke. "I didn't hide it," she said softly. "I just didn't need to prove it." Malik smiled slightly, almost with admiration. "Well, you proved it now." Then he stood up and walked away. She didn't need the validation. But something shifted inside her. Not pride, not relief, but recognition. For once, someone wasn't surprised she was strong. They were impressed because they had known it was possible. For the rest of the week, Madison's days passed in a quiet rhythm. But it wasn't the same rhythm as before. The silence now wasn't one of alienation. It was respect. She wasn't invisible anymore. But she still felt unseen in the ways that mattered. Because beneath the stares and the whispers and the headlines students scrawled in group chats, no one truly understood what that moment had cost her. How long she had held back. How deep she'd buried the instinct to strike when insulted, mocked, violated. How many times she had clenched her fists in her hoodie pockets and whispered her father's mantra like a prayer. Only when there's no other choice. And Blake had made it impossible to find another choice. When he ripped the necklace from her neck, it wasn't just a violation of space. It was personal. That pendant carried the name of her grandmother, Ruby L. Carter, one of the first black women in Chicago to fight school policy against suspending black students disproportionately. Ruby had once been dragged from a school board meeting by police. Madison had worn that necklace since the day Ruby died. It was a vow, a tether to the fight before her. Blake hadn't just mocked her family. He had desecrated it. And so she had responded. With control. With precision. With silence. The very same silence that now echoed through Ridgeway like an earthquake's aftermath. By Friday, the video had over 20,000 views. It wasn't just a school incident anymore. It was a statement. And people were starting to realize, Madison Carter wasn't quiet because she was scared. She was quiet because she was watching. And when the time came, she acted. Just once. But once was enough. Blake Radcliffe hadn't returned to full form. Not even close. By Monday morning, it was clear that something had broken. Not a bone, not a wrist, but something deeper. Something invisible. It showed in how he walked. How he no longer stood tall at the center of crowds but drifted on the edges like someone uninvited to his own party. Students still greeted him, but it was automatic, like muscle memory. Their eyes always flickered elsewhere. Their conversations grew shorter. Their laughter less natural. He tried to recover the old patterns. He cracked a few jokes in the locker room. He commented on a girl's outfit during chemistry. But it all fell flat. There were no reactions. No ripples. And that silence crushed him more than any takedown ever could. Blake had spent years perfecting his grip on Ridgeway's hierarchy. He knew which teachers to charm, which students to ignore, which enemies to mock until they broke. His father had once told him, "Leadership is about presence. You don't need to shout if the room listens when you speak." But now the room didn't listen. Now the room barely looked up. And the worst part? He still didn't understand exactly how he had lost it all. Madison Carter didn't gloat. She didn't stare him down in the hallway. She didn't retweet the clips or make statements. She just kept being herself. Quiet. Unbothered. Still sketching in the margins of her notebook like the chaos around her wasn't even happening. But every time Blake saw her, he felt it. The shift. The fall. The moment he stopped being a presence and started being a memory. On Tuesday, Principal Radcliffe called Blake into his office. "You've been quiet lately," his father said, hands folded across a polished mahogany desk. "I've had a few teachers mention you haven't been yourself." Blake didn't answer. Care to explain? Blake stared at the diploma hanging behind his father's head, Harvard Law. Frame. Pristine. Earned decades ago. Probably through the same confidence and entitlement Blake had inherited. "She embarrassed me," Blake muttered. His father leaned forward. "Who?" "Madison Carter." The principal paused. "The girl from South Chicago?" Blake nodded. His father sighed. "Blake, you let a girl humiliate you in front of the entire school." "She didn't just humiliate me," Blake snapped. "She beat me. And she didn't even try that hard." His father's jaw clenched. "I've looked into her records. You should have been more careful. Her father's former military. Her family has a history of activism. That necklace? Civil rights heirloom. You shouldn't have touched it." That stung more than anything. Even his father, a man who taught him dominance, now implied he deserved it. "You're not helping," Blake muttered. "I'm being honest," his father said coldly. "There are people you don't provoke. She's one of them." Blake left the office burning with shame. Not because his father had scolded him, but because for the first time he realized he had never been the strongest person in the room. Just the loudest. And Madison? She had been strong all along. She had just waited for the moment he gave her permission to show it. That afternoon, Madison walked through hallway B, the same hallway where she had taken him down. The floor was clean. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant. A few juniors leaned against the lockers talking about their weekend plans. They parted silently as she passed. Blake was at the far end, leaning against a locker like a ghost of his former self. Madison didn't look at him. But he watched her. And he felt it again. That chill. That echo of power that didn't need to announce itself. Later that night, Blake sat in his room staring at the screen of his cracked phone. He had rewatched the video. Not the viral version, just a private recording a friend had sent before it exploded online. He watched it again. And again. He paused at the moment when Madison looked down at him. Her knee on his chest. Her fingers wrapped calmly around his wrist. Her voice clear. "Say please." He hated that word now. Hated what it had taken from him. But he also understood what it gave her. Not fame. Not revenge. Control. Total, unflinching control. Because she had waited. She had warned him. She had told him not to cross the line. And he had. And now he couldn't uncross it. In Ridgeway's halls, power had always been a performance. But Madison didn't perform. She didn't ask for validation. And that made her untouchable. On Thursday, Madison entered the library just before lunch, headed to her usual corner table. The light filtered through the tall windows, casting warm beams across the pages of her sketchbook. She sat down, pulled out a pencil, and began to draw. And slowly, almost shyly, a girl from her biology class sat down across from her. Then another student joined. And then another. No one said much. But they stayed. Not because Madison had asked, but because they were drawn to something real. Not power. Not fear. But presence. The kind that didn't demand attention. The kind that earned it. By Friday, Ridgeway High was no longer the same school. The architecture hadn't changed. The staff still roamed the hallways with clipboards and coffee cups. The football team still jogged laps after last bell. But something in the air was different, heavier, quieter, more alert. The name Madison Carter had become something unspoken, not out of fear but reverence. The kind of reverence usually reserved for the untouchables, the ones who didn't need to threaten or boast or flaunt. She had walked into Ridgeway invisible. Now, without ever raising her voice, she'd made herself undeniable. In her English class, the teacher gave an open prompt. Write an essay about a time when silence spoke louder than words. When it was Madison's turn to read, she stood slowly, unfolded a sheet of paper, and began. I believe silence can be the most powerful form of resistance, she said. Not because people have nothing to say, but because they choose not to waste words on those who aren't worth listening to. And when the time comes, if action is necessary, that action won't need to be explained. There were no names in her essay. No references to hallways or fists or videos. But everyone in the room knew exactly what she was talking about. Especially Blake Radcliffe. He sat 3 rows behind, his hands clasped tightly under the desk, his gaze locked on the back of her hoodie. Not in anger. Not in hatred. In understanding. It was the first time in his life he felt like he didn't deserve to speak. When the bell rang, students stayed still for a few seconds too long, caught in the weight of what they'd heard. Madison gathered her things and walked out without looking at anyone. No nods. No thanks. No performance. She didn't need applause. She had already said what needed to be said. That afternoon, during lunch, she returned to her usual seat in the library. But this time she wasn't alone. 3 girls from her history class joined her, quiet at first, then gradually bolder. They didn't talk about the incident. They talked about music, about sketches, about the new elective opening next semester. Madison laughed. A soft, brief laugh that made them pause. It wasn't loud, but it was real. And that sound, in that moment, was more revolutionary than any throwdown could have been. Meanwhile, Blake sat in the cafeteria alone. His tray untouched. His phone dark. He didn't even try to insert himself into conversations anymore. The worst part wasn't being excluded. It was being irrelevant. He overheard a group of sophomores behind him. Did you see her drawing on the bulletin board? Yeah, the one with the woman holding a torch and chains breaking? It's like, symbolic? I don't know. Feels important. Blake didn't turn around. He already knew they weren't talking about him. He wasn't the symbol anymore. He was the cautionary tale. And the drawing? Madison had posted it quietly without signing it. It depicted a black woman standing on cracked stone, a broken shackle at her ankle, holding a lantern that lit up a blindfolded statue in the distance. Some students thought it was about justice. Others thought it was about Ridgeway. But those who had seen what happened in the hallway knew it wasn't metaphor. It was memory. By evening, Madison walked home under a pale autumn sky, the leaves crisp under her sneakers. Her hands were tucked into her hoodie pocket. Her pendant, the silver one Blake had once torn from her neck, rested safely against her collarbone, a quiet heartbeat she carried with pride. She thought about everything that had unfolded. The silence before. The explosion. The silence after. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vengeful. She felt still, balanced, as if something long bent had finally straightened. At home, she placed her sketchbook on the table, opened to a fresh page, and began to draw. Her hand moved deliberately. Not to distract. Not to process. But to remember. Because while Ridgeway would move on, forget, evolve, twist the narrative, she wouldn't. She didn't need a record of the moment. She had lived it. And that was enough. The following week began like any other at Ridgeway. Bells chimed, announcements echoed, students trickled into classrooms half awake. But a subtle shift lingered. People walked softer, spoke slower. And when Madison Carter entered a room, silence no longer meant avoidance. It meant respect. She wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. She didn't start a movement or lead a protest. She didn't create a viral campaign or seek validation. What she had done, what made her unforgettable, was far simpler. She had drawn a line. And when it was crossed, she didn't scream. She acted. And then she walked away. That was all. Yet somehow that quiet act had become a fault line. It split Ridgeway into 2 eras, before Madison acted and after. Blake Radcliffe, once the gravitational center of that school, now drifted like space debris, no orbit, no pull. He still came to class. Still wore the same clean varsity jacket. But the magnetism was gone. He no longer controlled conversations with smirks or glances. His locker no longer drew crowds. His jokes landed like bricks in a quiet room. In second period history, the teacher mentioned Ruby L. Carter, the civil rights activist Madison had mentioned in passing during an earlier presentation. The class turned to look at her. Madison didn't flinch. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. The name spoke for itself. After class, one of the younger students approached her in the hallway. "Is it true your grandma got arrested for protesting school rules?" Madison paused, then nodded. She wasn't scared of being arrested. She was scared of staying quiet. The boy blinked, nodded back, and walked away in awe. By now, even the teachers knew. The counselor discreetly asked if Madison needed support. The art teacher offered to feature her sketches in the spring exhibit. Madison accepted neither with glee nor pride. She simply said, "Thank you," and moved on. She was never after recognition. She was after peace. But peace, she knew, had to be earned in a place like Ridgeway. That afternoon, Blake sat beneath the old oak near the football field, where he once held court with his entourage. Now he sat alone, fingers running through grass, lost in thought. He had replayed the moment too many times to count. He tried to reinterpret it, reframe it, justify it. But no matter how he twisted the memory, one thing remained. He had said please. And not because someone had forced him to. Because someone made him realize he had no other choice. Blake wasn't angry anymore. He was empty. But maybe he thought that was the first step. Maybe empty meant he could start again, if not at the top, then at least as someone real. He glanced at the school entrance and saw her, Madison, walking toward the gates, headphones in, hoodie up, sketchbook clutched to her side. For a brief moment, their eyes met. She didn't stop. She didn't glare. She didn't look away. She just looked, then turned and walked on. And Blake realized something else, something deeper. She hadn't ruined his life. She had exposed it, stripped it of everything fake, and left him with a chance to figure out what came next. Inside the school, things began to settle into a new rhythm. Madison still sat near the window, still sketched, still barely spoke unless necessary. But now people noticed when she walked in. Now she was no longer the shadow. She was the storm that passed through and changed the weather. Forever. In English class, the final assignment of the quarter was simple. Write about the moment that changed you. Madison turned in a folded piece of paper with just one line on it. "I don't need to speak to be heard. But when I do, you better listen." The teacher didn't ask for more. She didn't need to. Madison had already written her story in silence, action, and precision. And Ridgeway had read every word. At True Echo, we believe justice doesn't always shout. It sometimes moves in silence, waiting for the right moment to strike, not to destroy but to awaken. Today you witnessed a story not just about a bully and a fighter, but about restraint, legacy, and the unshakable strength of knowing exactly who you are. Madison Carter didn't need to take the stage. She let the truth speak for itself. One moment, one action, and everything changed. I don't need to speak to be heard. If this story moved you, subscribe to True Echo, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to remember. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. We'll be back with more powerful, deep, and unforgettable stories.